Before we all go to war over the constitutional questions of how to pick the people who decide our constitutional questions, I gotta wrap up the last round of constitutional questions, still lingering in a year that doesn't seem to care much about the Constitution at all, actually. Weird how we simultaneously fight to uphold its integrity while we also take a dump on it like it's Nancy Pelosi's driveway. But to at least some of us, the philosophy and the application of the document still matters. Back when the lockdowns were first imposed by the trendsetters in San Francisco, and as they swept mostly across the country with few exceptions, I was asking the question with you that few of the people actually imposing the lockdowns bothered to consider: are these lockdowns even constitutional? It's not that my skepticism makes me automatically right. It's that a lot of these questions are legitimately unanswered. As today's decision notes, broad population lockdowns are unprecedented in American law. The term quarantine doesn't even strictly apply because quarantines, as a legal and historical matter, refer to the isolation of those sick with or exposed to a disease, not everybody population-wide. And crucially, quarantines are limited in time to the incubation period of the disease. But that, of course, is not today's standard. Apparently today, we're all just supposed to sit around and wait until Fauci says we've been good little boys and girls and we can have our constitutional rights back. But that's not the way any of this works. There was no forefather at the Constitutional Convention quoted as saying, okay, guys, if a virus hits, then this is all null and void. Back in the spring, it seemed to me the crux of this issue is a battle between the 14th Amendment's guarantee that nobody shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and the 10th Amendment's guarantee, or at least purported guarantee. Nobody seems to care that much about that one anymore, but it does still count too. The guarantee that all powers not explicitly delegated to the federal government shall be reserved to the states. On one side of that argument, seems like arbitrarily seizing control of your life, liberty, and property probably lacks a little due process. On the other side of that argument, there is nothing in the Constitution about virus mitigation, and states do hold broad police powers, particularly in urgent circumstances. As far as my own reconciliation of these two crucially important constitutional principles, at first I wanted the Bill of Rights smacked right across San Francisco's face by the ghost of James Madison. And even though the extent of the lockdowns and the creative ways in which state and local governments ruined lives in the months since have actually surpassed my fears from the spring, I've since tempered my stance. I've decided that where there's ambiguity, I am going to err on the side of states' rights. Why? Because on uncertain, unprecedented issues, mistakes are going to happen. And we know that because we've watched mistakes happen across the country for months now. And where mistakes are guaranteed, decentralizing them is wisest. Localizing the mistakes ensures that a mistake in San Francisco doesn't apply here in Montana. It also ensures that you and I have maximized power to correct the mistakes that affect us. If I don't like my governor or my county health board, I have much more power to lobby them or replace them than I do the President of the United States or any other federal institution. So as much as it pains me to even tepidly side with San Francisco on this one, I don't want a federal mandate of any sort, because even federal mandates I like set precedent for federal mandates I don't. That, and I think expecting the feds to come in and save us all abdicates our duty as citizens, but I'll save that point to the end. I've delayed long enough already in getting to the actual court case for discussion. And to this case, just because I'm wary of a federal smackdown doesn't mean I can't appreciate the spirit of a federal smackdown, and that's exactly what happened last week, courtesy of U.S. District Judge William Stickman IV, presiding over a constitutional challenge to Pennsylvania's lockdown orders. And it's a very appropriate name since he's the man giving him the stick. The way he's writing, he might as well be Judge Randy Marsh.
I thought this was America. Isn't this America? I'm sorry, I thought this was America.
It's a 66-page scathing decision. I can't get into every legal crevice in this case, though if you are interested in the finer details, I recommend Viva Fry's breakdown. Linked in the description, he'll navigate you through the technicals. For me, I'm just here to smell the apple pie and hear the eagle scream and fondly reminisce about just what in the hell this country used to stand for. Judge Stickman writes, broad population lockdowns are such a dramatic inversion of the concept of liberty in a free society, they are to be presumed unconstitutional unless the government can demonstrate they are pursuing an important end achieved through narrowly tailored means. Judge Stickman warns of the dangers of deference to good intentions, of sacrificing liberty for perceived safety. He writes, the state of Pennsylvania undertook their actions in a well-intentioned effort to protect Pennsylvanians from the virus. However, good intentions toward a laudable end are not alone enough to uphold government action against a constitutional challenge. Indeed, the greatest threats to our system of constitutional liberty arise when the ends are laudable and the intent is good, especially in a time of emergency. Judge Stickman goes on to demolish the inconsistent application of Pennsylvania's lockdown order. But before we get to that, one of the state of Pennsylvania's arguments was actually more absurd than the lockdown they were trying to defend. In fairness, it wasn't necessarily their primary argument. The state did argue for their 10th Amendment police powers referenced earlier, but one of Pennsylvania's arguments was that this constitutional question is now moot because the lockdown order has expired and the state government is now letting Pennsylvanians move around freely again. When else would this argument ever apply? Yeah, sure, I killed a bunch of people back in the 80s, but the legal question on that is moot because now I let everyone live. Yeah, sure, I used to mug people on the streets all the time, but those days are over. Now I leave everyone to their possessions freely. Obviously, I'm not accusing the state of murder or theft in the strictest sense. I'm saying just because you quit injustice now doesn't erase the injustice that you did, and it doesn't address the question of whether or not you'd be justified in doing it again in the future. Because as Judge Stickman notes, Pennsylvania's suspension of the lockdown order is not a rescission. Pennsylvania claims it can reinstate the order at any time. The governor had previously called the reinstatement of a lockdown order a reasonable expectation prior to the election. Well, good try, or maybe terrible try, but I get it. In a legal battle, you gotta wield every weapon that you have. I can understand why you'd try to pile on whatever you can when the judge isn't buying your core arguments. But the trouble is, even if he wanted to buy them, he can't, because you banned the sale of non-essential items. And that's where this judge really shines, in absolutely eviscerating the silly, arbitrary, and inconsistent application of Pennsylvania's lockdown order. In general, the restriction of fundamental rights articulated in the First and 14th Amendments in this case will require elevated judicial scrutiny and review. The government must have an important or compelling interest achieved through narrowly tailored means, or the least restrictive means possible. And of course, the means weren't narrowly tailored. They weren't tailored at all. They were just flung against the wall to see what sticks. Indeed, hilariously, one of the facts revealed in this case was that Pennsylvania never even defined the term, quote, life-sustaining. That was their version of essential versus non-essential. Per the lockdown order, everyone had to stay at home except to access, support, or provide life-sustaining business. And what the hell does that mean? They never defined. Life-sustaining isn't defined in law. It isn't defined by the governor's team. Federal industry classifications don't make that distinction. Questioned about that definition, a member of the governor's team said, "We didn't write down a definition specifically, but just translated the sort of common understanding of life-sustaining or not." Well, if the understanding is common, then why can't you explain it? And of course, because this term had no meaningful definition, it also had no meaningful application or effect. As Judge Stickman writes, closing R.W. McDonald and Sons did not keep at home a consumer looking to buy a new chair or a lamp. It just sent him to Walmart. Refusing to allow salons to sell shampoo or hairbrushes did not eliminate demand for those products. It just sent the consumer to Walgreens or Target. And ironically, this favoritism toward larger retailers only concentrated crowds, the very thing the state's gathering restrictions were otherwise supposed to stop. But hey, it's not like that inconsistency on the gathering restriction is really all that damaging anyway, because the governor was already a much more direct hypocrite on that issue too. It's hard to take the governor seriously when crowd size restrictions are placed so arbitrarily and inconsistently on businesses and organizations. Harder still to take him seriously when he looks the other way on the spring and early summer of Black Lives Matter protests, and it's outright impossible to take him seriously when the governor himself participates in the protests.
Governor Tom Wolf, Harrisburg Mayor Eric Papenfuse, and Police Commissioner Thomas Carter marched with Black Lives Matter protesters on the streets of Harrisburg Wednesday afternoon.
Black Lives Matter!
If the government is restricting fundamental constitutional rights without a clearly articulated goal, and without narrowly tailored means to achieve it, it doesn't meet the scrutiny necessary for the policy to survive. And that's why Judge Stickman concludes the lockdown order was unconstitutional, writing, "The liberties protected by the Constitution are not fair weather freedoms, in place when times are good, but able to be cast aside in times of trouble. The Constitution cannot accept the concept of a quote-unquote new normal, where the basic liberties of the people can be subordinated to open-ended emergency mitigation measures. Rather, the Constitution sets certain lines that may not be crossed, even in an emergency, and Pennsylvania crossed those lines. Now, of course, this decision will be appealed. The governor has already said as much, which is weird because I thought the question was moot. If the question is moot, then why bother appealing the question? But whatever. Maybe this one will be appealed to the Supreme Court if the Ginsburg superfans haven't burned it down by then. As I mentioned at the top of the video, I'm still cautious with federal crackdowns, even if I like the outcome of this federal crackdown, not just because of the principles of states' rights and federalism, but because I think it makes us as citizens too comfortable and we neglect our obligations. It's actually a subtle reference in Judge Stickman's decision. He says, in emergency circumstances, even a vigilant public may let down its guard over its constitutional liberties, only to find that liberties once relinquished are hard to recoup, and that restrictions persist long after immediate danger has passed. I don't read that passage and think, okay, now it's the federal government's job to swoop in and save us each and every time this happens. I read that passage and think, okay, how about let's not let down our guard then, actually? How about let's take responsibility for ourselves? The federal government isn't capable of coming in to save us every time our liberty is eroded in this way, and it shouldn't be trusted to anyway. That is not the nature of government. The nature of government is the lockdowns. The nature of government is constriction. The nature of government is the consolidation of power and the accumulation of control. And the only functional safety against that nature is a vigilant people who culturally value their inherent God-given rights more than any supposed safety some important-looking guy in a suit claims to promise. That's why the answer is not federal Judge Stickman, the superhero here to save the day, though I do admire him. The answer is for you and me and everyone in our communities to stay vigilant in the way he prescribes and remember the wrongs committed against us this time and vote out the people who committed them, or better yet, fill their seats ourselves so it doesn't happen again next time. We can all sit around waiting to be saved, and hey, maybe Stickman will come save us all someday, but in the meantime, we'd be much better off getting started saving ourselves. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.